What's going on, vinyl community? Welcome to another video with the Record Spinner. In today's video, I'm going to be ranking the Pink Floyd studio catalog. This will be my second attempt at ranking an artist catalog, my first one being my favorite band, Kiss, and it was quite well received, so I figured I'd do my next favorite band, being Pink Floyd. Let me emphasize that this ranking is solely my opinion. It is neither right or wrong. If you think that the final cut is the best Pink Floyd album, then I respect your opinion. Besides, you might agree with me on some things. But anyways, enough of the chit-chat. Let's jump into what this video is all about. Now, there are 15 Pink Floyd studio albums, and coming in at number 15 at the bottom of the barrel is this one. 1969's soundtrack from the film More. And the reason why this one is at the bottom of the list for me is simply because it really is a pure soundtrack album. Not so much like how, the Floyd would do Obscured by Clouds, and when you listen to it, it sounds as if it's a cohesive album. This is truly a soundtrack album in all its rights. And I think it's down to how director Barbet Schroeder wanted the Floyd to compose music. Basically, he wanted the music to sound like it was coming from like a car stereo or a party, and so that usually makes way for a lot of like small little instrumental bits with things such as like a Spanish piece, the party sequence, Up the Khyber, things like that. It's songs like that that are just so un-Floyd-like in terms of, how their albums are usually structured, that this album kind of stands out in a way. But despite all that, there are some really great tunes on here. We have the opener, Cirrus Minor, which is just a great ethereal Floyd tune. The Nile song, oh my goodness, it is perhaps the Floyd's heaviest tune, absolutely fantastic, one of my personal favorites. And then on this album are two huge highlights from the time that the band performed live frequently on stage, being Cymbeline and Green is the Color. But in all honesty, this album stands out the most in the Pink Floyd discography simply because it is almost the most un-Floyd-like. Coming in at number 14 is this album. It was bound to happen some point, 1969's Agama. Now, I'm not going to touch on the live portion of this album because, honestly, I think the live portion is fantastic. It's a great live document of what the Floyd was doing back in the day. But for the studio side, the band decided that each member would get half of a side of vinyl, to varying results. So right off the bat, Richard Wright has his 4-part suite called Sisyphus. Some parts are really cool, some parts are very self-indulgent, and I don't say that in a snobbish way. And then Roger Waters gets 2 tracks. He has Grantchester Meadows, which is a great English pastoral, folky kind of tune. It's definitely the highlight, and it's probably one of the greatest early Floyd tracks. And then we get to several species of small furry animals gathered together in a cave and grooving with a pict. If that isn't music concrete, I don't know what is. And then the other highlight is David Gilmour's The Narrow Way, particularly the 3rd part, because it's a 3-part suite. That's where it really takes off. It's really great. And then we have Nick Mason's The Grand Vizier's Garden Party, which has pan flutes and drum bits, reverse cymbals. It's interesting, and honestly, I've listened to the studio portion top to bottom just to really make sense of it, and I do like it because it has its charm, and I think this was perhaps the most experimental the Floyd got on record, but honestly, this is one that you go to last. Coming in at number 13 is this album, 1983's The Final Cut. Is it a Pink Floyd album, or is it a Roger Waters solo album? You decide for yourself. Basically, this album was supposed to be an album called Spare Bricks, which was going to feature tracks that were left off of the Wall album or were included in the Wall movie. And as that was taking shape, the Falklands War had occurred, and Roger had his strong opinions on that subject matter, alongside his views on Margaret Thatcher and warfare in general. So basically, this album turned into a political podium for Roger, since he has no qualms with voicing his political opinions. And honestly, this is the furthest that the Floyd drifted from their sound. You basically have Roger right front and center, and Michael Kamen just orchestrating the Philharmonic Orchestra in the background. Richard Wright wasn't even in the band at this point. David Gilmour kind of appears sporadically throughout the album. And then Nick Mason only drums when it's applicable, and he doesn't even appear on the final track, Two Suns in the Sunset. So who knows what the Floyd could have turned into if things were to continue in the direction they were going in when this album came out. And it sounds like I might be bashing this album, but I really am not. There are some good tracks. The notable highlight on this is the song Not Now John, which is the most Floyd-like sounding song on this record. The one that gets represented the most on compilations is the Fletcher Memorial Home. The title track is probably one of the most heart-wrenching songs I've ever heard in my life. And there's also the track When the Tigers Broke Free, which was included in the Wall movie, did not appear on this album until subsequent copies came out in 2004. And you really need to be in the right kind of mindset to listen to this album because it really is a downer. Coming in at number 12 is this album, 1987's A Momentary Lapse of Reason. Like I said with the Final Cut, that could be seen as a Roger Waters solo album, whereas this could be seen as a David Gilmour solo album. Basically just due to the fact that there is a revolving door of musicians that appear on this album, such as Tony Levin, Phil Manzanera, Carmine Appice, just to name a few. But honestly, you listen to the Final Cut and then you approach this and you realize how integral David was to the Pink Floyd sound. He just offers that loose, lucid kind of quality to it, whereas, Roger was basically the ideasman that provided, the strong themes and the lyricisms. You can pretty much hear on this record that David is working hard to find a solid, comfortable common ground with the Floyd, with tracks such as Learning to Fly, On the Turning Away, and Sorrow, which are just classic sounding Floyd tunes. Richard Wright is kind of back in the fold. He doesn't really appear, prominently like the others, as well as not being featured in the band Photograph with David and Nick. But I do recommend checking out the remixed version of this album, which appears on the later years box set, where they used a lot of Richard's live parts in the mix. And Nick Mason also re-recorded some drum bits here and there. Definitely worth checking out. And also, I should mention that this album is really a product of the times since it came out back in the late 80s. Heavy use of synthesizers as well as drum machines, where you have a perfectly capable drummer of performing drum parts. The remix really does kind of take away some of those 80s elements, and it sounds more like a Universal Floyd album, but this album is really a nice return to form. Coming in at number 11 is this album, 2014's The Endless River. Now, this album was done as a tribute to Richard Wright, and like I had mentioned before, Roger was the ideasman, David brought forth that sort of lucid quality, Richard was the glue, and his influence is extremely strong throughout the Pink Floyd catalog, and it stems from the early sessions of the Division Bell, as well as some new bits that David and Nick worked up for the release. And essentially, this is a album that includes 4 extended pieces of music. Some of it's ambient, some of it's kind of jammy in places. It's almost kind of reminiscent of some of the early Floyd stuff. It's really, really cool. And the vinyl format is the best way to listen to this album, simply because each piece of music takes up a side of vinyl. The only real, legit song that appears on this album is the closing track, Louder Than Words, which is, I think, a really nice musical epitaph to leave the Floyd legacy on. And I really enjoy this album a lot, but I feel like I'm kind of biased simply because this was the first Pink Floyd album that I lived to see come out as a brand new album. Who knows, at this point, this might be the only Pink Floyd album that I lived to see come out as a brand new album. And I listened to it a lot when it came out, and I was really digging on it. But sometimes I listen to this now in retrospect, and I think that it could perhaps work maybe slightly better as if it was included as a bonus with a deluxe Division Bell session. Almost like how there was that ambient album called The Big Spliff that they worked on at the time of the Division Bell, but it never came out. However, bits and pieces were used in this album. I think you kind of need to be in the right mood to listen to this, and I don't mean that by any substance. Basically, it's just a full-on, just almost ethereal, meditative kind of album, and honestly, it's a rather decent one, I think, to close out the Floyd legacy. Coming in at number 10 is this album, 1970's Atom Heart Mother. The band members hate this record, but honestly, I love it, and it is one of my favorites. This was the band's foray into working with choirs and brass ensembles, particularly on the title track, which takes up the entire first side of the album. And it's a really cool listen, but it does not really fit within the progression of the Floyd sound. They basically kick things off with Piper, then go into Saucerful, and then they jump to metal. And you kind of have this period of like 1969 and 1970 where they were really trying to find their identity, and this album is definitely indicative of that. But even though the piece of music is not highly regarded by the Floyd themselves, it does have its following, and I'm a huge fan of it. And then on the B side, we essentially have Agama Redux. Each band member contributes a song to the side, but this time it actually works. We have Roger Waters' If, Richard Wright's Summer 68, the big highlight being David Gilmour's Fat Old Son. And then we have Nick Mason's contribution, which is Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast, which includes the band playing along with the sound of cereal and frying eggs. It's definitely an interesting listen, and honestly, this is probably one of the most creative Pink Floyd albums ever. Coming in at number 9 is this album, 1972's Obscured by Clouds, otherwise known as music from the film La Vallée. This album is extremely underrated. They were working on this album at the same time as they started to perform Dark Side of the Moon live in concert, and it was the director of La Vallée, who was Barbet Schroeder, who also directed the More film from '69 that the Floyd did a soundtrack for. He had commissioned them to work on the soundtrack for this album, and with this album, it is not so much the traditional case of the More soundtrack. This is very much a well-rounded off Pink Floyd album that does include songs that were featured in the La Vallée movie, and also includes some dialogue on the closing track, Absolutely Curtains. But this album has so many fantastic songs on here. We have the opener, Obscured by Clouds, going into When You're In, Burning Bridges, Childhood's End, Free For. The big highlight of this album is the song What's of the Deal, which is one of Pink Floyd's long-lost greatest songs. David Gilmour actually revived that particular track on his On an Island tour back in 2006 to kind of reclaim its throne. And honestly, even as underrated as it is, this is definitely one that is worth checking out. Coming in at number 8 is this album, 1968's A Saucerful of Secrets. This is the band's second album, perhaps the most transformative album, since it all coincides with the departure of Syd Barrett and the arrival of David Gilmour. And it's this album that pretty much paves the way in terms of the direction that Pink Floyd would be going in the future, particularly on the title track, which is a 10-minute piece, which has, a real kind of structure to it, and it pretty much sets the tone on what they would continue on pursuing. And there's all kinds of great tracks on this record. We have Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, which is pretty much Roger's first, real moment of glory as a songwriter, and was basically a big live staple in their live set to come in the years. We also have tracks like Let There Be More Light and Corporal Clegg, which is kind of in this sort of space rock kind of vein. And then, of course, we have Jug Band Blues, the final track, which is a Syd Barrett tune, which basically it is him saying goodbye, and he's pretty much well aware that his days were numbered in the Floyd. And as much as the early Floyd stuff can be an acquired taste to someone, this perhaps is one of the most important albums that would lead the way for them. Coming in at number 7 is this album, 1994's The Division Bell. Now, where Momentary Lapse of Reason was kind of like a return to form for them, this album really brought them back into the forefront. This is just absolutely a fantastic album. Richard Wright is back fully in the band, and to add a little bit of new blood, the lyrics were written by Polly Sampson, who was then David Gilmour's girlfriend, but would become his wife. And what's really cool with this album is that even though this is the new up-to-date modern Floyd without Roger, there is an underlying theme with this album, kind of like how there were themes with the other albums in the Floyd's discography that Roger was a part of. And that is the theme of communication, kind of like how we have the two statue heads next to each other on the cover, as well as the song Keep Talking, which includes some spoken word bits by Stephen Hawking. This album has so many amazing songs on it. We have Marooned, which actually won a Grammy, A Great Day for Freedom, Richard Wright sings lead on Wearing the Inside Out, the great U2 sounding Take It Back, Coming Back to Life, and of course, High Hopes, which for many years people thought that that was the last true Pink Floyd song before The Endless River. And honestly, if that was the case, they really nailed it because they were kind of almost looking back into the past. If you look at the lyrics for High Hopes, it kind of looks back at the group's kind of formative Cambridge days. And there's also the song Pulls Apart, which, you know, you kind of have to think, is David singing about Roger? Is he singing about Sid? You know, there's a little bit of nostalgia going on with this album alongside the theme of communication. And honestly, when it comes down to any of the Gilmour-led Floyd albums, this is the one I go to the most. Coming in at number 6 is this album. The album that started it all, folks, 1967's The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. The only album to include primary vocalist, guitarist, and songwriter Syd Barrett. And as big as Pink Floyd is, and how much people like to point at albums such as The Wall, Wish You Were Here, and Dark Side, if it wasn't for this guy here, there would be no Pink Floyd. And any of the albums that came out after this one would have never happened if it wasn't for this album simply coming out and Sid getting the ball rolling for them. This album has so many great psychedelic rock tunes and early Floyd classics such as Astronomy Domini, Scarecrow, Bike, the instrumental Interstellar Overdrive, which was a big live staple for the band at the time. And then we have some bits of like whimsical fairy tale fantasy type tunes with things such as Lucifer Sam, Matilda Mother, and Flaming. I mean, the songs on this album are a fine example of how much of a genius Syd Barrett was. He truly was a genius. And it's really sad when you can kind of see how he spiraled down after this album, because if you listen to the songs he was writing for this album and then you listen to his solo albums, it's a total contrast between both of them. It's really, really sad when you listen to them and you can hear that difference. But this album is just simply so important and significant because it got the ball rolling for the Floyd, and it also is indeed my favorite Pink Floyd record. Coming in at number 5 is this one. 1971's Metal. And this is the album where the Floyd really found their music identity. And like I mentioned earlier, the natural progression in terms of the Floyd sound was starting off with Piper, then Salsa Full of Secrets, which was the follow-up, and then 3 years later with this album. And this album is truly a gem. The big notable track is the song Echoes, which takes up the entire B-side of the album. It's a big 23-minute epic, which includes that distinctive piano getting fed through a Leslie sound. There's truly fantastic stuff. And then the opener of this album is the really cool Doctor Who-esque sounding One of These Days, fan favorite Fearless, the bluesy Seamus, the nice kind of soft, almost folky sounding Pillow of Winds, Saint-Tropez. I mean, this album is just absolutely flawless. This is a band that sounds absolutely determined and confident. They left their psychedelic space rock days in the past, and they were finally purging forward. Coming in at number 4 is this album, 1977's Animals. This is my second favorite Pink Floyd album. It is their heaviest album, and it's one that has a rather interesting story, which dates back to 1974. They were basically working up material, which was going to be the follow-up to Dark Side of the Moon, and originally it was going to be Shine On You Crazy Diamond, and these 2 other songs that they wrote called You've Gotta Be Crazy and Raving and Drooling, and those songs ended up becoming Dogs and Sheep. They basically got reworked, rearranged, rewritten, since Roger pretty much had his eyes on the whole kind of thematic process that came with Floyd albums at this point. The theme of this album kind of goes alongside Animal Farm, where society and people are divided into subspecies of animals, the very business-minded dogs, the wealthy pigs, and the mindless sheep. It's very much a social commentary on society. It's one that just, if you're really pissed off at the world, this is an album that you crank up loud. And honestly, just David Gilmour's guitar work is absolutely blistering on this album. He delivers some of his best guitar solos in things like Dogs and Sheep, including the talk box and Pigs. It just sounds absolutely, I hate to use the word gnarly, but it sounds absolutely killer. And it's even at this album that you can kind of sense a shift in the direction for LaFloyd. Roger is taking more of a dominant approach in terms of the songwriting. And then, I mean, of course, Gilmour had co-wrote Dogs, but there's no contributions from Richard Wright in terms of the songwriting. So it kind of paves the way for what would come next in the Floyd's legacy. Coming in at number 3 is this album, 1975's Wish You Were Here. This was the big, daunting follow-up to Dark Side of the Moon, and honestly, it is a very melancholy album. This, of course, features the song Shine On You Crazy Diamond, which, of course, is about their former frontman and leader, Syd Barrett, and, of course, to kind of add to the lore of that song, they said that when they were mixing the song in the studio, Syd Barrett did appear there, and no one absolutely recognized him. Kind of sad. And there's also some songs that kind of reflect the music business, because since Dark Side had taken off, they were essentially superstars playing stadiums and arenas, and they pretty much already achieved everything they set out to achieve. So songs such as Welcome to the Machine and Have a Cigar are very much reflections on those thoughts and feelings of the music business. And then, of course, we have the title track, which is a great ballad and became a longtime favorite of fans, became a stage staple for the Floyd, as well as being somewhat of like a classic rock, radio standard. It honestly is a very melancholy album, very reflective in terms of their newfound fortunes and where exactly they can go from there. But honestly, this was the last real true kind of group effort, since Roger would take a more dominant approach in terms of their leadership. Richard Wright does co-write some things on this album, and his influence, especially towards the end of Shine On You Crazy Diamond, where he kind of does that little eulogy at the very end, is quite profound. It's absolutely beautiful sounding, and it's an absolutely fantastic album. Coming in at number 2 is this one, 1979's The Wall, the big, ambitious 2 LP concept album, which tells a story about a character named Pink and how he builds a metaphorical wall around himself, separating himself from the outside world, all stemming from the last show of the Animals tour, where the band were playing at Montreal's Olympic Stadium, and Roger was feeling absolutely no connection between himself and the audience. And to kind of add fuel to the fire, the fan was scrambling onto the stage, and he spat at the fan's face. And this led to him wanting to do this album, which essentially just started off as a production, which included a wall separating the band from the audience. But there kind of had to be some narrative to it. So, of course, Roger went on to kind of vent in his best musical way with a synthesizer, drafted out a demo, and then presented the demo to the band. And for pretty much, I would say, a year to 2 years, they built this album. And at this point, I mean, Richard Wright does appear on this record, but he essentially got kicked out by Roger after it, although he did perform on the tour. And honestly, the tour is absolutely groundbreaking for presenting such a large theatrical style production to rock concerts. It's truly important to that, and this album is just absolutely great by any means. It includes the band's #1 single, Another Brick in the Wall Part 2. It includes some great tracks such as Young Lust, Hey You, Run Like Hell, the opener In the Flesh, Mother, and of course Comfortably Numb, perhaps maybe the most single best Floyd musical moment ever. Just the total contrast between the verses and the chorus, and then David Gilmour's solo at the very end of it. It is absolutely sensational. A lot of people would consider this to be their best album, but I held it back at number 2 simply because even though it is so great, it is essentially Roger Waters running the show, and nothing could ever match up to the #1 spot. And honestly, did you guys see this coming? 1973's The Dark Side of the Moon. What can be said about this album? I can't even say it's a great album. This is a great work of art. This album includes all of the feelings and emotions that one goes through in life, whether it be about time, money, mortality, sanity, death. It is all here on this record. And Roger Waters does a fantastic job, painting a picture in the listener's mind as to the feelings that he was feeling at the time, alongside his contemporaries, members of the band and whatnot. And the themes on these albums are still relevant to this day. They chime with the mindsets on many people almost 50 years later after this album came out, including myself. I found myself relating a lot to the lyrics of this album growing up as a young adult. And even though I mentioned that Wish You Were Here was the last kind of real group effort from the band, on this record, each member is firing on all cylinders. You have Roger Waters delivering such poignant lyrics. You have David Gilmour providing such amazing guitar work, especially his solos on Money and Time. You have Nick Mason doing the very distinctive Rototom intro in the beginning of Time. And then you also have Richard Wright, who delivered the song Grey Gig in the Sky with a great vocal composition by Claire Torrey, as well as the main theme to Us and Them, which actually stems from some sessions that they did in Rome back in 1969 for the Zabriskie Point film. They provided a couple of tracks for the soundtrack, and they basically just kind of held on to this piece until this album. And it was honestly this record that really broke it wide open for the band. They kind of found a sort of surprising single with Money. It was a huge hit in the States, and it just kind of opened the floodgates for this band. And they basically just set out everything that they wanted to achieve from the get-go. And one could say that this album is overrated. Some can say that this album gets more emphasis than others in the Floyd discography. I personally agree with that. But honestly, you got to give it up to this album. This album is just truly influential, very significant in terms of recorded music with its use of synthesizers and sequencers and whatnot. It's just an all-around brilliant work of art and is hands down, in my opinion, the best Pink Floyd record. So there you guys go. That is my ranking of the Pink Floyd studio catalog. If you enjoyed this video, please go ahead, give it a like, and subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support this channel, be sure to check me out on Patreon. See you guys in the next video, or on the dark side of the moon. And most importantly, keep the record spinning.